Have you ever felt that quiet tremor inside the soul? The sense that something sacred is slipping away, not through rebellion, but through a slow, silent drift you cannot name. Father Gabriele Amorth once said that the most tragic journey toward eternal loss is not a loud fall. It is a gentle slide, unnoticed even by the person living it. What if the real danger is not the sins you regret, but the moments you no longer feel regret at all? What if the enemy's deadliest trap is the one that looks harmless, familiar, almost peaceful? So many souls, Father Amorth warned, walk toward eternal separation while believing they are safe. Not because God has turned from them, but because they have stopped turning toward Him. Today we uncover why this happens, what truly pulls a soul away from the light, the hidden sign the enemy fears you discovering, and the path back that every Catholic must hear. Stay with me. What unfolds here may reveal something essential about your eternity. There is a kind of spiritual fading that does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, like dusk settling over a house where the lights were never turned on. Father Gabriele Amorth often said that the souls most at risk were not the defiant, but the ones who slowly stopped noticing the distance growing between their hearts and God. You can keep the routines of faith, Mass, familiar prayers, a reverent posture, yet feel the flame inside grow smaller year by year. Not because you chose darkness, but because the light no longer feels urgent. The conscience no longer stirs. The interior life becomes still, but not the holy stillness of prayer. It is the stillness of neglect. The Catechism teaches that hell is not God's punishment, but the ultimate consequence of a soul choosing separation. And that separation rarely begins with a dramatic choice. It begins with indifference. It begins when a person stops wrestling, stops listening, stops allowing grace to disrupt the comfortable corners of their life. Jesus warned of this in Matthew chapter 7. Many will call His name, believing they are walking with Him, yet their hearts moved in a different direction long before they realized it. Father Amorth saw this again and again in those who sought His help. People who never intended to drift, yet woke up one day unable to feel the presence they once knew. The danger is not sudden collapse. The danger is gradual dimming. A soul does not fall all at once. It fades through tiny refusals, quiet delays, and the belief that tomorrow will be easier. And this fading, painful as it is, opens the door to the enemy's most subtle strategy, one that Father Amorth said destroys more souls than temptation ever could. There is a moment in the spiritual life when the enemy no longer tries to tempt you loudly, because it no longer needs to. Father Gabriele Amorth said the devil's greatest triumph is not leading a soul into grave sin, but lulling it into a state where it no longer cares whether it is close to God or not. Have you ever heard that subtle voice inside? The one that says, "You're fine, nothing is wrong, everyone lives like this." That voice does not come with force. It comes with comfort. It asks for nothing except your spiritual sleep. And sleep, Father Amorth warned, is more dangerous than rebellion. This is the anesthesia of the soul. Not the sharp pain of temptation, but a numbing. Not the roar of darkness, but its soft hum. Not a crisis, but a settling. Jesus spoke of this in Luke chapter 11, when He described the strong man guarding his house, calm, undisturbed, unaware that his false peace is the very chain that binds him. Father Amorth often compared this to Catholics who avoid big sins, yet drift further from the Lord because they never confront the small compromises shaping their hearts. And the truth is painful. Small compromises rarely feel like sin. A skipped prayer, a confession delayed, a habit excused, a resentment nursed, a distraction entertained. Individually, they seem harmless. Together, they shape a life where God no longer has room to speak. The enemy never demands your soul all at once. It asks for inches, the inch of inattention, the inch of fatigue, the inch of postponing grace until tomorrow. But those inches become miles. Miles become habits. Habits become identity. And identity shapes eternity. Father Amorth witnessed this pattern countless times. People did not come to him because they rejected God. They came because they had slowly forgotten how to desire Him. Their hearts were intact, but numb. Their faith was present, but hollow. And it is here, right in this quiet drift, that the true reason so many souls fall begins to take shape. Not in defiance, but in the refusal to let God touch the very place where healing must begin. There is a wound inside every human heart that God continually tries to touch, and there is a part of every human heart that quietly pulls back. Father Gabriele Amorth said that most souls do not fall because they reject God outright. They fall because they resist the exact place where God is trying to enter. Have you ever felt that tightening inside when grace gets too close? When a homily touches a hidden wound? When a call to forgiveness hits too deep? When confession demands honesty you are not ready to give? That resistance is subtle, but it is real. And Father Amorth believed it is one of the enemy's most effective battlegrounds. The Catechism teaches that grave sin requires full knowledge and deliberate consent. Yet long before a soul reaches that point, something more delicate begins. A refusal to change. A refusal to open. A refusal to let God rearrange the parts of life we have learned to protect. Revelation chapter 3 gives a haunting picture of this spiritual temperature. Lukewarmness is not hatred of God. It is the slow decision to keep him at arm's length. It is the heart saying, I want you, but not here, not in this habit, not in this wound, not in this part of my life. Father Amorth often described this state as the breeding ground of spiritual collapse, because the soul begins to negotiate with grace. It allows God to enter the comfortable areas while fiercely guarding the painful ones. But healing never happens in the areas we already feel safe. Healing begins in the places we refuse to touch. And this is why so many Catholics drift into darkness without ever feeling a decisive moment of rebellion. They never said no to God. They simply stopped saying yes. They stopped surrendering. They stopped letting him challenge the parts of life that need conversion the most. The enemy thrives in that half-open posture, not fully committed to God, but not fully against him, just suspended, unresolved, unhealed. This is the quiet place where eternity begins to lean in one direction or the other, and it leads directly into the deepest danger of our age. A life so loud, so distracted, that the whisper of God can no longer reach the heart at all. There is a darkness in our time that does not shout, threaten, or strike. It distracts. It fills the mind with constant motion until the soul no longer remembers what silence feels like. Father Gabriele Amorth warned that the devil no longer needs to provoke dramatic sin when he can drown a soul in noise. Look at how quickly the heart reaches for a screen whenever a quiet moment appears. How hard it is to sit still for even 30 seconds without checking something, anything. How silence feels unnatural, even uncomfortable. This restlessness, Father Amorth believed, is not innocent. It is spiritual erosion disguised as ordinary life. C.S. Lewis once imagined demons rejoicing over humans who simply drift by, entertained, overstimulated. Father Amorth saw this unfolding in real souls. People who were not evil, not rebellious, not hostile to God, yet had become strangers to their own interior life. The devil did not tempt them. He numbed them. This numbness is deadly because it hides the decline. You can lose your moral sensitivity without ever feeling a single moment of crisis. You stop praying, not out of rejection, but out of distraction. You delay confession, not out of defiance, but out of fatigue. You lose peace, not through sin, but through noise. Jesus warned that the seed of the word can be choked by the cares of the world. Not wickedness, just constant preoccupation, just busyness, just noise. Father Amorth called this the slow suffocation of the soul. A soul can die of noise the same way the body can die of lack of air, quietly, gradually, unnoticed. And perhaps this is the deepest tragedy of our age. We have grown so used to distraction that we cannot hear God even when he speaks. The whisper that once guided us, the discomfort that once corrected us, the longing that once called us home. all buried under a life too full to notice. Yet even here, even in this dim silence, where the heart struggles to feel anything holy, there is something the enemy fears. A movement of humility that awakens the soul from its sleep. And that awakening becomes the turning point of the entire spiritual journey. There is one moment in a person's life that makes the devil tremble more than any ritual, any command, any prayer of deliverance. Father Gabriele Amorth said it is not power that breaks the enemy's grip. It is surrender, the quiet, trembling kind, the kind that rises from a tired soul whispering, "Lord, I need you." The enemy can endure your routines. It can endure your busyness. It can endure your distractions, but it cannot endure humility. Humility tears open the very place where grace enters. It is the door the devil cannot close. Have you ever felt that sudden ache? The kind that hits you during a mass you barely made it to, or when you watch someone pray with a sincerity you lost years ago. That ache is not weakness. It is the first crack in the shell that has hardened around your soul. Father Amorth believed that the moment a person admits their need for God, the spiritual battle shifts instantly in heaven's favor. This is why the sacrament of reconciliation is so feared by the enemy. Confession is not merely telling sins. It is stepping out of hiding. It is the act of saying, "I cannot heal myself." That sentence alone destroys more demonic influence than 1,000 spiritual struggles fought in pride. And then there is the rosary. Father Amorth often repeated that the devil blindsides the proud, but shrinks before the humble, and shrinks even more before the mother of the humble. He said that when a trembling soul picks up the beads, it is not clutching plastic. It is reaching for the hand of the woman who crushes the serpent under her feet. Humility rearranges the battlefield. A soul on its knees stands taller than any temptation. A heart that breaks open becomes stronger than the darkness that once numbed it. The devil's only weapon is pride. So when a soul chooses humility, the enemy loses its ground. And once the soul begins to awaken through humility, Father Amorth warned that a final sign often appears. A sign more dangerous than any temptation, because it reveals whether the heart is truly returning to God or drifting toward a point where it may no longer feel Him at all. There is a moment Father Gabriele Amorth feared more than temptation, more than suffering, more than spiritual attack. It is the moment a soul stops feeling the weight of its own choices, not because the person turned against God, but because the conscience has grown silent. Have you ever noticed when something that used to trouble you no longer does? When a small lie passes without discomfort, when a harsh word leaves no regret, when a sinful habit returns and your heart barely reacts. That numbness, Father Amorth said, is the final warning before the soul begins to slip out of the reach of its own sensitivity. St. Paul described this state in Ephesians chapter 4. Hearts darkened, not by rebellion, but by a slow loss of spiritual perception, a dimming of the inner light, a disconnect between what the mind knows and what the heart no longer feels. 3 signs reveal when a soul is entering this dangerous threshold. First, prayer becomes distant, not rejected, just forgotten. Days pass, and the silence that once called you to speak with God no longer stirs you at all. Second, sin loses its sting. Actions that once awakened your conscience now fade into the routine of life. The interior alarm grows quiet. Third, the Eucharist stops drawing the heart. Mass becomes an obligation rather than an encounter. The presence of Christ becomes familiar rather than astounding. What makes this so frightening is that nothing looks alarming on the outside. You can still attend church, speak of faith, and present a life that appears intact. Yet inside, something essential is fading. The tenderness that once recognized grace. The awareness that once guarded the soul. Father Amorth often said that the devil celebrates not when a soul sins, but when a soul stops caring that it sins. Because when the conscience falls asleep, the enemy no longer has to fight. The person simply drifts. And in that drifting lies the greatest danger. A heart that no longer feels its need for God will eventually stop seeking Him altogether. Yet even here, in this dimming twilight, grace waits for a single movement. a small, trembling turn that can still pull the soul back toward the light. There is a moment, often unnoticed, when grace begins to breathe inside a soul that has grown numb. It rarely arrives with tears or dramatic conversion. It comes softly, like a memory of peace, a quiet ache for something deeper, a sudden awareness that life has grown thin. Father Gabriele Amorth believed this stirring is one of the clearest signs that God has not stopped calling, even when the heart has stopped listening. Sometimes it awakens during a simple mass, when a familiar hymn suddenly feels like a message rather than a melody. Sometimes it stirs in the quiet after a funeral, when eternity feels closer than it should. Sometimes it rises in a moment of exhaustion, when the soul realizes it cannot keep living on spiritual fumes. This awakening is small, but holy. It is the beginning of the return. The Church has always taught that conversion is not a single event, but a lifelong homecoming. Ecclesia semper reformanda. The Church is always being renewed, and so is every soul within her. Father Amorth saw this reality often. People who did not come to him because they were strong, but because they had finally grown tired of carrying their wounds alone. Luke chapter 15 paints the most tender portrait of what happens next. The prodigal son begins walking home with nothing to offer but his weakness. And the father, seeing him from far off, runs. That run, Father Amorth said, is the entire gospel in motion. It is what happens every time a soul whispers the smallest yes. Many fear that returning to God requires spiritual strength. But the truth is simpler. It begins with honesty. It begins when the soul no longer hides behind busyness, distraction, or numbness. It begins when a person says, "Lord, I miss you," even if they do not yet know how to change. And when that whisper rises, even faintly, the enemy loses his advantage. Because a feeling heart can be healed, a waking conscience can be guided, a humbled soul can be rebuilt. This gentle return prepares the way for a final moment, a moment where the soul must choose the direction of its eternity with clarity and courage. There comes a moment, quiet but unmistakable, when God places a soul at a crossroads. A moment when drifting is no longer possible, when silence feels heavier, when the heart senses that eternity is not a distant idea, but a direction forming with every choice. Father Gabriele Amorth said this moment is where heaven leans close, and hell does too. Many people imagine the final judgment as something that happens only after death. But Father Amorth insisted that judgment begins long before we take our last breath. It begins the moment we decide what we will embrace and what we will avoid. It begins in every yes to grace and every postponed surrender. It begins when the soul finally realizes that neutrality does not exist. Have you ever felt a gentle push inside, a prompting to forgive, to confess, to let go of a sin you keep excusing, only to silence it because the timing felt wrong? That silence is not neutral. It is a decision. Every delay shapes the heart. Every hesitation builds a habit, and habits form the path our eternity follows. St. Paul speaks with unflinching clarity. Now is the day of salvation. Not when life becomes calmer, not when wounds finally close, not when we feel ready. Salvation begins in the present moment, because grace only works in the present. Tomorrow, Father Amorth warned, is the devil's most convincing lie. The tragedy is that many souls approach this sacred crossroads without recognizing it. They believe they have more time. They believe the call to change will return again. But a heart can only ignore grace for so long before it begins to lose the ability to hear. This is why the enemy fears your awakening. He knows that one sincere turning, one moment of true surrender, rewrites the entire spiritual landscape of your life. What was drifting becomes direction. What was numb becomes alive. What was lost begins to return. And for those who are older, those who have walked through decades of wounds and victories, this moment carries even greater weight. Because the soul has lived long enough to see what truly matters. Long enough to understand that eternity is not far away. long enough to know that the choices made now ripple into forever. Father Amorth believed that this turning point is where the battle is won or lost. Not in the drama of temptation, but in the quiet courage of a heart finally saying, "Lord, I choose you." What you decide in this moment shapes the final movement of this message, where all these threads draw together into one truth that every soul must hear before the journey ends. In the end, Father Gabriele Amorth taught that no soul is lost because God turns away. Souls are lost because they stop turning toward the one who never stopped calling. Even the smallest movement back to him carries more power than the years spent drifting. If this message stirred something in you, let that stirring become a prayer. Comment the words, "Lord, draw my heart back to you." Your comment is not just a phrase. It is an act of faith, a small doorway through which grace can enter. Stay close to this channel, share this message, and keep walking with Christ each day. Your eternity is shaped by the direction of your heart. Let it turn toward the light.